Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I know there's a few people running late, but that's no problem. They'll be able to join. So I did just want to start by saying thank you to everybody that is here with us today. We really appreciate you spending the time this morning with us and learning about this topic, as it's incredibly important across our community. For anyone that is unfamiliar, my name is Stephanie Morris, and I'm the director of the Refugee Alliance of Central Iowa. And ROSI, which it's often referred to, is a collaborative of stakeholders who are vested in making sure that Central Iowa is as welcoming a place as possible for refugees and immigrants. And today, our topic, we typically have a annual refugee summit, which is a day-long event that we have just tons of experts come in and talk about a lot of the different issues that affect refugee communities. And it's typically geared towards service providers or educators. We have health providers, mental health providers. We have case managers and people involved with the juvenile court system or the justice system, to be able to give them information to learn how to serve refugee and immigrant communities better, and to be aware of resources that already exist, and just make sure that people are as connected as possible. So this year's summit will be offered 100% virtual. And today's topic is about safe housing within refugee and immigrant communities. And so today we have 4 of the leading experts in this subject. I will let people introduce themselves, though, as they'll do a much better job than I will. So first, Hieu, could you introduce yourself and Monsoon?
Of course. Thank you, Stephanie. Hello, everyone. My name is Hieu Pham. I am a director of programs for the Des Moines office of Monsoon, Asian and Pacific Islanders in Solidarity. We were formerly Monsoon United with Asian Women of Iowa. We are a culturally specific, linguistically specific organization, providing statewide services for victims of gender-based violence, that's domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking in Asian Pacific Islander communities. So that includes communities that are East Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian, and in West Asia, or what's more commonly known as the Middle East. Our overall mission is to end all forms of gender-based violence in our communities and to build healthy communities through transformative justice and social change. We have 2 offices, one in Iowa City and one in Des Moines. We started as a program within Iowa Coalition Against Sexual Assault in 2003, and then we became a 501c3 in 2007. We're funded by a combination of state and federal grants, and I'm happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hieu. Sorry, I was muted there for a second. Jodi, would you mind going next and introducing yourself and Luna?
Sure, my name is Jodi Bowden-Fuentes, and I am the Domestic Violence Program Coordinator for Luna's Des Moines office. I started with Luna about 5 years ago in the Marshalltown program, where we initiated a rural-based holistic program, and we have embraced that holistic approach throughout the Des Moines initiatives as well. Luna initially began as a volunteer organization in 1999 and became a nonprofit in 2002. We are the culturally specific agency that works with Latinx communities throughout Iowa. We partner with mainstream agencies across Iowa and support members of our community with obtaining safety, which oftentimes includes housing, immigration relief, and collaborating with justice. Our mission is to help families to build futures free from violence, and we all work together towards that goal.
Thank you so much, Jodi. Pauline, would you mind going next and introducing yourself and NISAA?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Pauline Karamera. I have been working with NISAA since 2017 in July. Right now, I'm a SA advocate. NISAA is a community-based organization seeking to address gender-based violence in African population living in Iowa. So we provide different services among crisis intervention, language advocacy, legal and immigration referral, housing, education and employment assistance, medical advocacy, transportation, and so many others. So I think that's all.
Thank you so much, Pauline. And last but not least, Zeb, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Zebulon Beilke-McCallum. I'm the Director of Housing and Economic Justice at the Iowa Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I've been doing domestic work at the Coalition for just over 10 years now. Seems like it's flown by. At the Coalition, a little different from the other folks on the phone, we do minimal direct services. We really serve as a tool for all of the domestic violence programs in the state, including the other brilliant experts on this panel. So we work directly with Luna, with Monsoon, with NISAA. We also work with Embark, who are all members of the Coalition, to make sure that folks are getting those quality domestic violence, sexual assault, and trafficking services. We do a few legal services and some financial literacy direct programming and a minor client assistance too, but really our main service and mission is to support the local programs.
All right, thank you, Zeb. All right, and so the first thing that we are going to talk about, Hieu, would you want to lead that off? Or I can read the first kind of topic that you guys were going to talk about.
Oh, well, you know what? I can make it easy for you. We can kind of introduce this format to folks, and then Zeb and I can take over.
Okay.
Right? So
Perfect.
the way that we're going to do this, we called it a virtual roundtable as opposed to a virtual panel. We just thought everyone has been attending virtual panels for so long. And also we wanted to break that hierarchy and really have this be a conversation, right? A planned and sort of guided conversation between Zeb and I. So we will ask questions, but we will also participate as well. So that's roughly the format for today. And we'll do that until about 11:15. At around 11:15, Stephanie's going to return and she's going to make sure everyone's awake and also make sure that we have a Q&A and answer any questions that folks might have. All right. So Zeb, I think that Zeb was going to start us off.
I will start off with the first question. And I'm going to leave this open so you can all think about it, and then whoever wants to respond first can jump in. So this is our first question. Domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness for women and children. Survivors face unique barriers to accessing shelter and affordable housing, many of which are linked to abuse and victimization. How are the barriers different or exacerbated, made worse for immigrant and refugee victims?
I can speak to that. A lot of the people within our community are undocumented or have limited work history. When we look at the programs that are available for assisted and long-term transitional housing beyond the traditional 10 to 14-day shelter stay, most of those programs have barriers requiring that the head of household have status. We may have mixed status families. We may have US citizen children with an undocumented parent. We may have political asylum families. We may have families with no status at all. Those families have no resource and no support throughout most of the traditional models that we have in place for supportive housing.
Pauline, can I handle to you at this point?
You can go.
Sure. Well, again, I think there's a couple of factors, right? I think housing is one of the leading primary concerns for victims and survivors, right? When they're thinking about leaving their harm doers. For immigrant and refugee communities, a little bit, to sort of accent what Jodi is saying, we have limited income issues. We have fewer economic opportunities issues. So our survivors are telling us that they can't get great jobs, right? They have difficulties finding jobs at all because of their limited English. There's greater housing instability in general. There's limited access to information that's provided in English, right? So we're talking about language justice here. There is the requirement that an extra barrier of reestablishing social networks and having reestablishing community, for immigrant and refugees. How to navigate mainstream services is also very confusing. And then culturally responsive services, right? In Iowa, we have, it seems a lot, 7 culturally specific programs, but sometimes programs or service providers that are mainstream don't even know that we are here and available to assist. And so, I mean, just on the top of my head, those are just some of the few barriers to housing that are extra for immigrant and refugee communities. And so you add those things and you add domestic violence and those dynamics, and you have a very tough situation.
Yes, I think Jodi and Hieu have said all. On top of the income, the immigration issue, it's come also the language, and then they don't know if those resources are there for them. For some of them, it's even hard to reach to culture-specific organizations like us or NISAA or Monsoon for help. Yes, when it comes for a mom who have 4 children to live, to go rent by herself, and then she's getting like $8 to $9 per hour. She doesn't even work full time. It's really tough on top of domestic abuse, which she's going through.
And building on that, our communities do tend to have larger family sizes, lower disposable income, and it is oftentimes a factor in families staying in abusive situations or victims returning to their harm doers. And we also have to factor in, especially with some of our communities that may not have the familiarity with technology. Most housing applications now are moving towards online formats. With COVID, I think that has accelerated, and we have that limited access that's just added another barrier on top of all of the pre-existing and recognized barriers.
Mm-hmm. And earlier we were talking about mixed housing issue, and we were maybe talking about like a sort of government housing, public housing, right? Subsidized housing. But if you're talking about just leasing an apartment, immigrant and refugee communities might not have a great credit history, right? They're for survivors that are leaving abusive relationships, they might not have an employment history. They might not be employed. And so there's going to be barriers there just for landlords looking at their applications.
And I just think about, to sort of jump in on all these great things other folks are saying, that all of those barriers that immigrant and refugee communities face are doubled down by the person doing harm and by batterers who will try and make it worse. So somebody struggling to with credit, the batterer might also intentionally make the credit worse. prevent somebody from having a job history, create evictions on their record, just exacerbating each of these things, which is what makes that domestic violence such a leading cause of homelessness. The other thing I was thinking about, based on what folks were saying, is some of these programs, like in some of the affordable housing programs, have rules or guidance, protections for family composition or family size or family status in fair housing or in our government programs around who's eligible for them, and that sort of sometimes mixed status families can get further eligibility. But just because those rules exist, if nobody knows about them or has them in the language for them to understand or to be able to access, it doesn't make a difference. Or even if they those protections exist, if the people administering the program don't understand how immigrant and refugee communities are eligible for some of these services and end up just wrongly denying them.
Well, I think that
happens all the time too.
Yes, I was going to say there's been plenty of times in which we have, or on several occasions, applied for some sort of subsidized housing for our client, there's an impression that because they're not citizens but they're legal permanent residents, that there's just an extra step there that needs to be done to verify their immigration status, that the person that is administering that application isn't willing to do. So there's advocacy there that has to be done, like housing advocacy. And oftentimes if it's someone without an advocate, how are they going to know to push a little bit harder, right? To question, why do they need to provide these steps, or sometimes to even explain the difference between, a citizen and a legal permanent resident. I mean, I've had to do that before. I think that a lot of these other barriers will sort of pop up. We'll get a picture of what we're talking about in terms of the difficult experiences of immigrants and refugees. I will take us to the next question, which kind of speaks specifically, right, to what we're dealing with here, and how some of the folks that are on this call, I think some who are a part of organizations that are assisting immigrants and refugees would want to know. So our next question is, for everyone here, what is the biggest misconception that the public or other service providers have about housing needs as it relates to domestic violence, victims in refugee and immigrant communities? And then in what ways have these misconceptions impaired or obstructed services for victims? So basically, yeah, what's a big misconception about housing, and how has it made things worse for survivors and victims?
So I'll take this one first. And I think for me, the biggest misconception I think about when it comes to other public service survivors is they really misjudge how talented and capable survivors can be, that folks are far more resilient than they are given credit for, and they have a lot more skills to determine where they want to live, what's best for their family, what are the best outcomes for them. And we as service providers don't spend enough time paying attention to survivors when they say, oh, I need to live in this neighborhood, or I need to live in this apartment, or these are my priorities around housing. And we don't give enough weight to those things and to the abilities of survivors to figure out those things for themselves.
Right, or maybe that's not what they really want or need. I think a big an issue for me sometimes is just the thinking of safety strictly in terms of removing survivors from their homes, right? Without thinking about, again, their resiliency, like Zeb has mentioned, what they really want, what they really need, and then also to understand sort of the landscape of housing, like, of what is affordable housing, is there transitional housing? For us, removing someone from their home and taking them to shelter, right? Is that really the appropriate measure? Sometimes a lot of our immigrants do not want to go to shelter, right? They would rather stay, with their abusers at their home, come up with a plan, and then leave when they have transitional housing, affordable housing, rather than go to shelter. Or sometimes we get a referral already from a shelter, right? And they have already been taken to one and they don't want to be at the shelter. Sometimes they have a misconception of what shelter means or looks like. Sometimes they think that it's a hotel. And when they get there and it's more like a dormitory style, they're like, no, I want to leave right now. So for me, emergency shelter is really just all temporary. And anyone who is assisting a survivor and places them in a shelter has to be sort of aware of that. That's what it means. And then there has to be a plan. Part of that safety plan has to consider that that's temporary housing. And then what are we going to do, right? To get them to a place where that it's real safe housing, right? Housing that is close to a daycare. If they don't have a car, they will need to walk across and drop off their children. It might be that it has to be in a cluster where there are other community members so that they can expand that social network, right? I mean, that is safe housing. That's more practical housing as opposed to an idea, and more problematically, right, of rescuing victims, sensing that, they're unsafe, and then taking them and thinking that we'll just plan later on how to address this issue.
Yes, yes. For this question, going for people we serve at NISAA, it's a little bit very difficult. First of all, our people, they don't understand what shelter is. Yes, sometimes we get referred already, they're in the shelter, and then once they reach there, it's not what they were expecting. Because back home, when something like abuse happened, they used to go to friends or to a family instead of going. There was no shelter actually. But right here, they cannot go to those friends or those family there. And then when they come to us as service provider, we don't have a plan, like a long plan for them. Shelter in 30 days. If we pay for you a motel, it's gonna be a week or 2 weeks. But what next after that? All of those things make them stay in their house, in that abuse relation. And also when we try to apply to public housing, they don't consider domestic abuse one of the requirements, violence one of the requirements to get in. Just you have to go through a waiting list to get in. And then that takes really long, especially here in Des Moines, really long. And the other thing I will add is that concerning where they want to live, that is another question. That's another issue we need to give a lot of time and then attention on that. As you say, they want to live close to the daycare. They want to live close to the hospital. They want to the store where they can just walk, because there is also most of them have transportation issue. Neighborhoods, it's another thing. Our community, they don't take domestic abuse. It's not only between the abuser and the victims. It's also families members who come in, community members who come in. I can just go to this neighborhood because I know the abuser's family or friend live there. So I need to go to another neighborhood when maybe that neighborhood is so expensive for her to go there, and she doesn't have much resources to live there. So yeah, I think that's.
No, that's an excellent point about the family dynamics, right? About it's not just an interpersonal violence situation between two people, family situation. You could be harm doers or mother-in-laws, brother-in-laws, and they could be living very close to each other or in the same household. And I think for us, it's not a resistance, right, to taking a survivor to shelter or at all, but really it's about, we want to make sure that it's done in a way that can ensure that they actually leave and not return, right? If we do anything in a hurry, and especially if it's a program that's removing people not just from a city, but taking them hours away to the closest shelter that they can find, well, that's just a temporary solution, and they're going to return back to their homes, without a really good plan in place that looks at really them, who they are, what they want, what their own resources are actually, right? And then also just the landscape of affordable housing and shelters, like what's there. So yeah, I mean, I think just repeating what everyone says, but I wanted to actually raise another point, which is why it appears, why, because I get this, this is a scenario that I experienced at Monsoon, and I'm not sure, but I have a sense that you would experience the same thing, Jodi and Pauline, is that, sometimes when we get a referral from a mainstream organization, they say like, oh, this person needs to leave their relationship, they want to go to shelter. They say that they want to leave, right? And we find out differently later, right? I try to explain that so much. I think there's a couple of things that are going on. Some that is related to culture, right? It might seem like, they feel like they need to be polite or defer to someone who is helping them. They're helping me, I'm going to trust them, right? Or be something related to trauma and being a survivor. If I say yes to this, I might get something else. But if I say no to this, I might be someone who's difficult to work with. I might not have services elsewhere, right? And so they say yes, and they seem to want that plan, but inside, they're questioning that plan. And for us, often the scenario is once they talk to someone who speaks their language and someone who understands their culture, then the whole truth comes out, and we recognize then, right? Okay, maybe not now, right? You're not ready for this now, or maybe not in not at the shelter. It would be much more appropriate to go to transitional housing, or much more appropriate to do an application for subsidized housing, right? Yeah,
Definitely.
I saw some nods, Jodi.
Yes, we see a lot of that. There is still in many, not just in DV providers, but also just in service providers across the board, there is a belief that leaving is going to make this person and this family safe. And that is very often not the case. Leaving could put that person in a much more vulnerable position and push them back to what we know is going to be a more violent situation the second, third, fourth, fifth, seventh time around, and so on and so forth. We really work with our communities to look at what is doable. First off and foremost, is there an immigration case pending that's going to give you more options in 6 months or in a year? What can we do with that time to prepare you to make a safe and smooth transition into a different living situation? We really work with, and I think all of us across the board, with especially with immigrant and refugee communities, work towards celebrating and uplifting entrepreneurship, because a lot of our people don't have the same options or access to employment. We may spend time doing far more extensive long-term services than many of our mainstream counterparts, simply because our planning process is so much more complicated. And also within the Latino community, we have also that overlapping family level, community level, church level, secondary abusership, where there's pressure from the church to remain in a relationship. There's pressure from family on both sides. There is lack of support within the community, or sometimes even, especially within our community and private renters, we find landlords that are hesitant to rent to someone coming out of a relationship. We find landlords, forgive me, who are hesitant to take on a renter who may have first month's rent but deposit coming from an agency, not recognizing that these are survivors. They are going to find a way. When they get to that point and they're ready, they will find a way. And it's up to us to help them get there, but not to push them or to take them there.
And I think about this honestly from a real data perspective too, that the number one predictor of how long somebody sort of on this is shelter safety place, that the more days somebody spends in shelter, each day somebody spends time in shelter, increases the likelihood that their next day is also going to be in shelter. That shelter is this kind of place that reinforces homelessness. Obviously, it has to be a part of the response, but I think looking at the history of this movement and how in the past it has de-emphasized the not white experience of domestic violence and deprioritized the cultural, the programs that you're talking about, that there is, that we need to be devoting more of our services and resources to the holistic response to domestic violence, and talking about some of these other housing and housing support services, which actually I think we've been doing a good job of talking about this next question already. So I'm just going to get into it, and then we can kind of talk about it more. There's often a focus on the importance of emergency housing for victims of domestic violence. Is this true for the communities we serve? If we sort of talked about that part. So if not, what types of housing are most beneficial to the victims you serve? So let's talk more kind of about that. What services you're providing can provide to assist survivors in that being safely housed.
I wonder, Zeb, if we can put you on the spot for a little bit to break out, to define the different types of housing. I think we're throwing out words there. And I have a sense that most people know, but I just never want to, I never want to assume. So what we mean by shelters, right? Or emergency housing, what is transitional housing, right?
Sure.
Permanent housing, subsidized housing.
I mean, I will be the first to admit that I am always learning when it comes to these things too, because frequently there is what our government or a funder says programs are, but then how those are actually implemented in process doesn't always follow the same thing either. So emergency shelter generally is a temporary living situation that is frequently in a communal setting with multiple folks and multiple families living under the same roof, though it doesn't have to be. And I will say definitely due to COVID, many of our traditional shelter programs have shifted to hotel or much more single family types of shelters. So there is some flexibility, but the idea is that it is temporary for a few weeks at a time to get somebody into a more permanent spot. Although the domestic violence shelter programs do operate based on a survivor-centered model. So folks that are in shelter can spend a lot more time in those shelters because they have so many of the barriers that we've talked about. Transitional housing typically is 6 to 24 months. Sometimes it's 6 to 18 months, but that is basically somebody has their own place, their own apartment. And
a lot of times, like some programs will have some kind of oversight, right? Like a shelter, you will obviously have staff there. Transitional housing, you might have an advocate with office hours there, but they're checking in. They're so it's not like a.
And I will say, the lines get somewhere, but depending on programs too, there are some programs that are exploring and operating with not 24-hour staffing of even shelters. So I think one of the things, sort of going back to that misconception conversation, that actually folks need less oversight than we provide, whether it's in shelter or transitional housing. The idea being, though, about creating more independence. I mean, for survivors generally, they have had plenty of oversight over their lives the entire time that they've been experiencing abuse. So being able to create more independence and freedom, I think, is good for them. A lot of survivors are interested in having access to that. And then the other term that sometimes gets injected into this conversation is rapid rehousing, which is folks being able to get their own place. Again, it's probably 18 to 24 months, but it's not in a program. They have their own apartment, and a program is probably helping them out with rental assistance, security deposit, that kind of thing for up to 24 months. And then ultimately, permanent housing is a place where folks have gotten their own place and are maintaining it without, there isn't a definitive end to subsidy or assistance or programs. They might still be engaged with the program, receiving support, talking with somebody, but the expectation is they're going to be able to long-term reside in that place. Were those the ones you were hoping I
Yes,
defined?
thank you, Zeb. What,
Okay.
right, because that will help us with the question, right? Like now we're asking, we're talking about what do we think are the types of housing that are the most helpful, right?
But I want to add one more thing into this then too, because I think sometimes what gets missed in this conversation is that the path to housing doesn't have to be housing. Like it might be that what somebody needs to be permanently housed is a job, and all they need for that job is a pair of steel-toed boots. So permanent housing can be getting somebody a pair of boots. It doesn't have to be shelter, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, permanent housing, that there are a lot of ways to get somebody housing. So I want to include that, which terminology wise often gets called flexible funding. So talk about that one too.
No, I love it. I mean, because obviously, you know, if you didn't have those steel-toed boots or a job, you're going to be in a house, but with any way to pay your, you know, your electricity, right? It'll be an old house or a dark house. Yeah. So back to that question for all of us.
I see Jodi nodding her head. I think
I think she's ready.
So as many of you know, I started my career in domestic violence as a multicultural shelter advocate here in the Des Moines shelter. Having started with that background, we do need to have that resource for that emergency shelter for when there needs to be an emergency exit. What I believe most of us find is that aside from those emergency where you have to get out right now, within our communities, by the time people are ready to leave, they have made a decision, they have made a plan, they want to take concrete steps. The survivors that we work with have thought about these. They've tried everything to make that relationship work, tried everything to maintain the status quo, and it gets to a point where it's no longer possible. And it can be as simple as making sure that someone has assistance with the first couple of months' rent till they can get on their feet. It can be making sure they have la olla para hacer tamales, the big pan to make tamales. It can be teaching someone to effectively use Facebook SWAT sites and sales sites to connect with potential customers. It can be as simple as connecting people with resources for childcare. It can be as simple as creating posters for that person's childcare in home. We never know what that looks like unless we really take the time to explore the options and talents of the people that we work with. And a lot of times it's as simple as, I don't know how to use the bus. I've gotten a job offer. I don't have transportation, but my babysitter lives close. Maybe it's as simple as spending a day riding the bus with a client and being willing to take that next step to do that holistic wraparound service and teach and open doors and share information with the people within our community. I do believe that the most effective way that we can support our families is through supportive long-term transitional housing. And by long-term, that's depending on the individual needs of that family. It could be 3 months. It could be deposit and a month's rent just to get someone up and running. It may be 2 months rent and learning about transportation options. It may be explaining what public charge, especially within our communities, and how that impacts accessing services for US citizen children. It really is very, very important that we have that open communication with our survivors and that we embrace their existing strengths and empower and build on those existing strengths. And informed is empowered. A lot of times there are beliefs within our communities that accessing programs is going to somehow be an issue in the future. And for some that might be, but most of the services that our families are looking for are standard services. And those services would not affect them in public charge evaluations in the future. I do believe that we need to expand on transitional housing. We need to have that as a resource going forward, and that our shelter options are vital. But realistically, I don't think any of us, even with the resources that we have available, could rebuild our lives in 10 to 14 days. And so what can we do to constructively support people so that at the end of 14 days, they're not walking back into a dangerous situation? So in that respect, when we look at all of the options, we try to work towards education, preparedness, and then best option for that person and their family. Transitional housing for us, I believe, is the biggest resource that would have the most long-term positive impacts on our communities.
I favor transitional housing too. I think there's diversity is good, but transitional housing, if it's done where there is some kind of, not so much oversight, but support, right? That around the clock kind of support. You would have advocates, domestic violence advocates, assisting running the transitional housing program. That could be available if they have an issue with their heat, if they suspect that their harm doer is stalking them and circling the neighborhood. I think it's really helpful to really prepare someone well, not just sort of throw them into an apartment where all of a sudden they're alone and now they're sort of on their own. Give them some time to adjust to life on their own. If it's an immigrant victim, this might be a very foreign experience to them. Perhaps they were stay-at-home moms. Perhaps they've never had a job for the first time. They're going to need some time to figure things out. They have to calm down, settle down, look for a job, figure out childcare. That takes months, right? And so having them in transitional housing with supportive services, someone to check in on them, right? To help them navigate, to help them build their social network, to help them find a job. That is just going to ensure that when they're ready to make the next, to take the next step into permanent housing or rapid rehousing, that they're going to feel much more empowered. They're going to be able to live on their own. That's what we want. And then of course, I think Zeb, you said it's called flexible
funding.
Flexible funding. Yes, to flexible funding for sure, of course. Because I mean, obviously we need that more, because transitional housing is great, but unless we have a plethora of that, then we have to think about how far do we want to move survivors, right? So Pauline earlier talked about safe housing, like how that survivors have an idea of where they want to live. It's not because they're necessarily asking for a great place to meet all of their aesthetic desires, right? But it's functional. It's going to help them go to work. And so if we had flexible dollars, because transitional housing, might not be available, it might be too far away, that would also be very helpful.
Another thing I can add regarding transitional housing, it's I have been working with someone with immigration status issue, which took it's almost now 19 months since she started her immigration paper application. All the transitional house, the time frame was 6 up to 6 months. So do you imagine what next after the 6 months of the transitional housing? She have been moving from shelter to transitional housing to transitional program to programs and city to cities, which is kind of really affecting her. She's getting connection in this place, and then by the end of 6 months, she has to move to another place. That is kind of another issue with transitional housing. It doesn't, and it goes by funds. No, I don't think we have a program for 2 years that's gonna be permanent. So until now, she doesn't have a papers. And then this is only one case, and we know out there is cases and cases. People are moving from state to state, city to city to get a place until they are independent.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at the long-term impact of that on trauma,
Exactly.
we work with people who are shattered. Oftentimes, they may be making their first friend. They may be making their first connection to a church or to a community. And just as soon as that becomes stable, there has to be a change in order to accommodate the scope of a program and the allowables of a funder. And that is incredibly destructive towards the reconstruction of oneself. When we look at families, we have to do that too sometimes. We'll move someone from Eastern Iowa to Des Moines, to Western Iowa, to Southern Iowa, to keep them safe while we're waiting for pending applications. Even though with a lot of the cases that we work with, we have prima facie statements, which should authorize people to get into services, there's great resistance in those programs from the administrators of those programs to accept that prima facie statement. Those are huge barriers. And regardless of what funding or expenses or any of that may look like, we have a fragile person who's just learning to grow, oftentimes with small children who are for the first time making positive connections, having to move over and over and over again. That is terribly destructive on the long-term impact and resilience of that family. When we look at, we don't want you to be safe for 6 months, we want you to be safe for life.
Yes.
And we are undercutting that simply because we have to work within the guidelines of programs that were established by people who have no understanding of the situations that our families work in. It's not unusual for domestic violence perpetrators to follow from place to place to place. There's an additional security risk. It's really not that unusual for victims to have some kind of criminal record, some kind of an encounter with law enforcement, some kind of eviction. All of those things factor in. And when we look at the programs that mainstream communities readily access, Section 8, HUD housing, public housing, all of those supplemental programs that we take for granted. Any of those experiences, especially when combined with a less than solid immigration status, makes that almost an insurmountable barrier. And so what happens is we move people from place to place to place.
Yeah, and I think that's the opposite of safety.
It is. It undercuts any growth. It undercuts the development of that social connection and that community resource base that is so vital that we take for granted.
I think about it all the time. I'm a gardener. I really like to garden. Let's see if this analogy works or not. But if I am constantly transplanting my plants every 2 or 3 months or 6 months into a new pot, you end up with dead plants. That is the result of this. And we, so as social service providers, are so often too, because of grant reportings or program guidelines or these things, ship somebody on a bus to another program because there's funding there or funding here, when stability and security would be so much better for that survivor or family. And the frustration I have around some of this is there's always more flexibility in programs than folks maybe recognize. And what we need is advocates championing that flexibility, so that when they ask for it, that they're getting a yes, we can do that. Yes, we can extend this transitional housing for additional months, for the paperwork to come through. Those are the kind of things that are allowed a lot of times by grantors and rural and funders, that individual programs are making decisions to not do that. And it needs to be better.
I am also a gardener, Zeb. And every time you pull that plant out of the soil, you're shocking the roots. And any growth that you may have had in the time in that pot, you are undoing every time you move it. The same with what we look at as oversight, right? Within these programs, you can overwater a plant. You can give it too much and it'll just drown. And you can give it not enough and it's going to dry up and not do well. And each of our programs, and especially within each of our communities, recognizing the unique needs of each community, we've all become gardeners of people and trying to keep people safe and rooted and fed, but not overwatered.
Jodi, all of my and Zeb, all of my plants die, so I am not going to take your gardening metaphor any further. It ends with me.
When I was home for these months while we were doing COVID, all my plants died. I came back to work and all my plants have come back to life because they were getting too much oversight, and now they're getting just enough.
So just a very quick comment on this question or topic before I move us to the next one is just, I think that, we need to find ways to not only address physical safety, but also economic safety. Our immigrant survivors often prioritize economic safety over physical safety. They are mothers with children, right? So that's why those things are important to them. So in order for us to really advocate for them and to help ensure their safety, we have to think about those things too, right? So my next question is kind of a little, we're going off a little bit, but I heard something about evictions from Jodi, and so that was my segue, right? So this is in regards to the temporary moratorium. Did I say that right, Sam? I make the word up all the time. On September 1st, the CDC enacted a nationwide moratorium. Basically, it's effective up until December 31st of 2020, saying that landlords cannot evict tenants, right? And this is supposed to basically address COVID concerns, right? My question here is for everyone on the panel, whether or not, one, you have seen tenants or the communities that you serve, the survivors that you assist, utilize this moratorium. Are landlords recognizing it? And maybe even more importantly, are judges recognizing it? And do you think that our communities even understand that it exists?
By and large, no. By and large, no. When the initial moratorium went into effect earlier this year and then ended, Zeb, you probably know the date right offhand. I'm sure you do. Can you give me that date?
First.
July
Yeah.
1st, was it?
Yeah. So the original
Yes.
Section 8.1 was in July.
Yes.
Because that was the one, and that's the one that the governor also had one, and that end. That one was just limited to government programs. Well, so there was the one that the governor issued. So Governor Reynolds issued a moratorium. There was a federal just Section 8 moratorium. Both of those expired earlier this year. And then the CDC issued this one. So no one could keep track of all of these.
But in essence, it's something that tells tenants that they cannot pay their rent, right? That they can use this template. There's a letter they can give to their landlords, right, to hold off on eviction. They still need to pay back that rent December 31st. There's some language there about some sort of payment plan that they would have to work out with their landlord, right? But it should effectively, right, in theory, hold off that eviction.
So
She's shaking her head.
Not so much.
Yeah.
When the earlier moratorium ended, literally, we had many clients, especially because a lot of our families work in the service industries. So when we had the initial shutdowns, we had lots of people out of work, and there was a moratorium on evictions. And we had, within our local office, we had multiple families that literally the day the moratorium ended, there were 3-day notices posted on their doors. No flexibility, nothing. And then there is the sudden fear of I'm going to be thrown out when we have funding coming through the pipelines. There's a plan in place, but the funding hasn't caught up to the need. These letters.
Oh, Jodi, I think you accidentally hit the mute button.
I've seen these letters. We've tried to use them with most of our families work with private landlords. They're not necessarily being respected. We are spending a lot of time doing housing advocacy. We've had several landlords say they're just going to put locks on the doors. They'll just come in with their friends and whoever and remove people's items. There have been a lot of tense conversations with landlords, making it very clear that there are laws that they have to abide by. And the problem with the CDC moratorium is there is no protection. December 31st, there will be 3-day notices posted all the way across Iowa. And a lot of the people within our communities are not familiar with the laws that are in place to protect them, and will get that 3-day notice to quit and they will leave, rather than to go through the steps that we take for granted, being English proficient, understanding the law, watching the news. Those community connections, the resources aren't distributing that information as effectively as we would like to see. We have limited access to Spanish news, and I'm sure that as we look into all of the other languages and the fountains of information that are available, I think we need to do a better job of making that a known and common resource for the families that we work with now more than ever, because they're going to need this. Because otherwise, December 31st, all of our at-risk clients, all of our clients that are on the edge of homelessness are going to get those 3-day notices, and they're not prepared for that.
Right. If they're not, I mean, I think my question is, they might already be getting notices, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think that it's widely understood. There's been so many of them. They're not enforced. We're hearing that judges don't even recognize them. They're unaware of them. The way that it's written, it's very vague, and it puts the onus on tenants and landlords to work something out, right? So there's just these dates. Just hold off on eviction, but figure out, you will have to pay the money back. But you need to figure out with this person that wants to evict you, very likely, how to do that. And so is it, if I pay you 1/3 of the rent, I won't be kicked out, or because I'm, you want me to pay a half, then you have a right to evict me? So there's lots of unaddressed questions, right? And I think another thing that I'm hearing is, from our communities, we are hearing that there's an awareness of it, but we're not seeing it utilized, one. And there's a sense that it's not really enforceable. What is this thing really? And then also having difficulties finding apartments because landlords are just going to be much more strict and scrutinize applications, right? Because they're afraid of someone using a moratorium.
And the late fees.
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of hours over the last few weeks with one landlord in particular, charging a $35 per day late fee, ending up in nearly $9,000 in late fees over the course of the moratorium, and so on and so forth. And we as advocates and as agencies need to be more and more informed on how those laws work with our client situations. And I agree. The verbiage in those moratoriums is very vague. It's very easily manipulated. It is not specific, and it doesn't really provide any kind of safety net to families that will be facing eviction and homelessness on the 31st of December.
And just to chime in on the biggest I think it's important to, a couple points I want to make. One, it's important to recognize why the CDC issued this unprecedented order in the first place, which was to save lives. And the fact that we know that homelessness and eviction is going to put families at huge risk of becoming infected with COVID-19, becoming ill, transmitting it to lots of other vulnerable people, continuing the spread of this deadly virus. So that's why we have this protection. And then to emphasize that it's important that folks use it. I think folks on here have really articulated why it's not a very good policy, because there is no enforcement mechanism and there is no incentive for landlords to abide by it either, because there isn't a rental assistance component provided. There's no way of paying back rent. There is no way of enforcing this. And it puts people into an impossible situation. So what happens when you have landlords, some of which who are counting on those rent payments to pay their mortgage payment, and so then they have folks living in their apartment that they are also mortgaged on that aren't receiving any rent, and then the bank is trying to foreclose on the landlord who can't pay rent because the tenants aren't paying rent, and the tenants aren't paying rent because this isn't a solution. It is a stopgap temporary measure that it is important for folks to use, but it's also why we need elected officials both here in Iowa with the governor and our folks in Washington, D.C. to act to protect lives and make sure that people can pay rent and stay in their housing. The other thing that I would say we're seeing too, kind of tied to the late fees, is also judges not doing evictions, but trying to order court fees for the eviction. So that shouldn't be happening. And the other thing I'll say is Iowa is a state that caps late fees. So landlords are limited in the amount of late fees that they can charge. So it's really important that we ensure that landlords are following the law when it comes to late fees that they can charge. My hope is that Congress is going to act sometime between now and the end of the year to solve this rent problem. So I actually would still really strongly encourage folks who are in a place of not being able to make rent due to COVID to try and show up to their eviction hearing, show the letter and put it off, because there is going to be time between now and November to solve this and act around whether it's making up rent payments or late fees. There's also a program run through the Iowa Finance Authority to provide some folks with rental assistance. I know eligibility around that program is more limited than it should be, but there are a few tools out there that just aren't strong enough.
Mhm. Well, we have 1 minute until Stephanie is supposed to cut us off for Q&A. We actually have like 3 or 4 questions left that we never got to, but we saw this coming. But I wanted to at least allow everyone to share, right? Anything else that they want to contribute to this discussion in the minute that we have. We could talk about some other things that we never brought up was education for tenants and landlords and why that matters in the context of domestic violence, right? How are our communities stepping up to help themselves, right? We want it to be a positive discussion as well, not just a everything is sort of wrong with everything kind of discussion. And then, in terms of other services that families would need besides just housing, what other services would be helpful. If any of you want to contribute to any of those topics, feel free to or add anything that you want in this time.
Within our community, we're seeing a move towards shared housing, cooperative housing. We have a lot of people whose income has been reduced because of COVID, because of DV, because of all of the overlapping issues that are going on this year. And we see several people within the community. We'll have a survivor and her family sharing a home with another survivor and her family, and splitting childcare, splitting financial obligations. I'm definitely going to follow up about the caps on late fees, because that is something we're seeing a lot of. But I think that we really need to just support the resiliency of the communities that we work with and be creative. If there is an option to do shared housing, for some people that's working out well. For some, it is adapting safety plans and postponing plans. But I think we really just need to be more and more. We always try to be, but every day we are trying to be more and more receptive to what the members of our community are telling us and what it is that this particular community, this particular family, what it is that they may need to be safe for today and for tomorrow. Because for a lot of our families, that is the priority right now. Is get me through today, get me through tomorrow, and we'll look at something long-term once some of this calms down.
I think what I've noticed, the thing that I'll share, is despite all of the barriers, right, the difficulties that we've talked about, what I've seen throughout, and this is even before COVID, but it just makes it it sort of crystallizes it, right, with the pandemic challenges, is the strength of our communities, right, that sometimes especially our survivors who are used to challenges and they deal with that on an everyday basis, that they're not asking for sometimes the help and the funding that's available, right? That they're finding creative ways to make it work, right? The shared housing situation. There's lots of people who move into with friends or family members, and they're ghost roommates, right? In an apartment or a house. And I'm looking at Zeb now because I introduced the term ghost roommate to him. That's when they're not on the lease. So we really appreciate things that funding that's also flexible and thinking about like lived lives of immigrants, right? Especially immigrants or survivors of domestic violence. Funding that allows us to pay directly the survivor and not a landlord, because maybe they're not on a lease, right? Maybe they're renting a room in a house, right? And the homeowner is not them. So there are programs, there's funding, there's services available. But without looking in a culturally specific way, they're going to miss out, right? And meanwhile, we have our immigrant and refugee communities that are just working really hard, right? But how much harder do they have to work, right? We can advocate for flexibility in funding or more funding to really convey the needs to mainstream providers, right? To alleviate some of that burden for our refugee and immigrant communities. Anyone else? Stephanie is on the call, but I don't know what she's doing right now.
I'm listening and I don't want to interrupt because I don't want to stop this conversation.
Okay, I wasn't sure, but I thought maybe you were attending to your kindergartner. So
no, she's luckily for me, Rosie's more mature than I am. And so she can self-facilitate her own kindergarten class all day. And then she'll come and teach me things after she's done. Like yesterday, she came and taught me about rods and cones and how you see.
Oh.
And how sight is perceived by eyes. So yeah, she's good. But yeah, I don't want to interrupt. This is scheduled until 11:30. Do we want to just maybe pause to see if people do have questions that they would like answered? And then maybe we could go back to any additional, I know that there were a couple of questions.
Yeah, that would be great, because I know that we just got to the tip of the iceberg. There are lots of things that we didn't even bring up. We didn't even talk about what housing for trafficked victims. And talk about, yeah, lots of things.
And
so,
anyone that's stuck with us for the last hour.
But we don't want to talk endlessly, right?
Well, I wanted to, yeah, so to open it up to our participants and attendees today, are there any questions that people wanted to ask right away? If you're unable for any reason to unmute, or if you're on a phone or something, if you you can either ask by just unmuting and asking, or you can always type into the chat too.
I see someone, I think Cassidy has asked, along with eviction moratorium rules, how else has COVID complicated matters?
In everything, everything. Quarantine is really a privilege. It is a privilege to be able to work from home. It is a privilege to access unemployment. It is a privilege to order your groceries delivered. Somebody is still performing all of the services that are required on a day-to-day basis. And largely those people performing those services come from our communities.
And the only thing I was going to add to that is, and that by performing those services are putting their lives at risk and putting their health at risk. So then you have folks who are working because they are deemed essential workers, facing domestic violence, facing eviction, facing economic abuse, and then get sick. And it's that piling on of challenges that makes things a lot more complicated. And there isn't the help right now, enough help for those folks.
I have a question. This is Lata De Mello from Monsoon. I have my co-worker Hieu Pham is on the panel. So, but this is for everyone. And I know Hieu just mentioned something about human trafficking. I know there are millions of dollars the U.S. government through the federal funding programs, as well as statewide, locally. There's so much money in human trafficking, addressing human trafficking. Housing, for instance, seems to be lost in that, in all those millions of dollars. And I will give you an example. Recently, I had to rely on a fellow service provider, that's a sister organization, fabulous people, to provide transitional housing for a victim. And they have nothing to do with human trafficking per se. And thank you, Zeb from ICADVA, for transportation for trafficking victims. What does that mean for any of you? If you want to address it, how do you reach out to people if you have no transitional housing? And not transitional housing, what I was offered was 2 weeks in a motel. I mean, that was embarrassing and shameful that we have millions of dollars going to raising awareness, but we have no good strategies or plans for victims of human trafficking and those who have come forward, because our experience has been most victims of human trafficking don't identify themselves as such. In fact, they don't want you to identify them as human trafficking victims. They say they're not victims, but those who have, how else do you think we could get the, funders to look at providing housing for human trafficking victims? Transitional, certainly, but not a 2-week motel stay.
I will offer my thoughts first. Lata, thank you for the great question. I think that we've invested in housing for so long in this country, and capitalizing on any energy around whether it's housing for survivors. We've actually seen some really strong movement at the federal level and HUD around housing for survivors, and actually that making sure that HUD understands that full valid definition of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and trafficking, and ensuring that they are eligible for all of those funds, I think is important. But I also think having dedicated housing sources for survivors of trafficking just makes sense, particularly because they are going to be folks who, like SA and DV survivors, are going to need more support over a longer time to recover and deal with the challenges that they face. And we just figuring out that flexible funding piece, that it's not just 2 weeks in a hotel or 1 month's rent plus deposit that's going to take it to get somebody on their feet, but that they
or flyers, Zeb. I think that's what my coworkers thinking. We share similar thoughts here. That, we're talking about survivors here, right? And I think earlier we talked about okay, we need solutions that listens to people on the ground who understand the lived lives of survivors, right? And how do we get to the people who can make these sort of changes, because so much money is being put into creating flyers to post on bathrooms, right? Or to give to hospitals so that they can create some sort of curriculum to train people how to spot a trafficking victim. As if some of that is very common sense, right? And if you also understand domestic violence and sexual assault, human trafficking is not its own entity, right? So, I mean, the frustration, I'll just speak for myself here, is that we know that there are so much money on outreach that has only reached so far and can only reach so far to affect people directly. How do we get that into housing? Expand housing, because housing is massively underfunded, and we know that it is the #1 issue, right, for domestic violence victims. So this is not a question that's necessarily for you to answer, Zeb. It's more rhetorical. But yeah, it is. But I think that we see that on the ground. Maybe Jodi and Pauline can also make some comments. They've worked with trafficking victims as well.
It's great to identify, but what are we going to do after they're identified?
And
that's the question.
That's the question I was going to ask Jodi next. What can we do as service providers, as people invested in communities, to change the status quo, to change what is going on? I can only offer what I've been saying to a few of the really well-meaning people who have started, say, with trafficking, about what Pauline mentioned about, someone who's earning $8 an hour, $9 an hour, Two, and this is for everyone who's doing Advocacy Day next year, about pushing for minimum wage, to start campaigning for minimum wage, a state level minimum wage. So there is no discrepancy in different counties. To look at the Pacific Islanders and their lack of Medicaid. So what happens is when they don't have Medicaid, they have to rely on meatpacking plants, for example, to provide medical insurance, which they cannot afford. And they're made to stay in hotels again and not allowed to build equity, to start their own, to have their own home. So there are ways that we keep people out of the system, and continued poverty and oppression through all these other means. So I'm hoping that all of us over here are more inclined to, you cannot solve this housing problem immediately, but you can join campaigns that ask for human rights, basic human rights for a start for human beings. So that's what I was going to offer, Jodi, unless you have more to add.
I have one little thing to add, and hello, Lata. It's always a pleasure to see you.
And me, you, Jodi. Thank you.
I think it's important that we all keep in mind that when the poverty guidelines were established in 1969, they were based on food, which was the greatest investment a family made. It is also very important to consider that if we readjusted those guidelines based on housing costs today, we would have an estimated, and this is from the internet, so it may or may not be accurate, an estimated 67% of American households would be below the poverty line. That is a tremendous consideration when we're looking at wage. Minimum wage is basically slavery, and it does not account for the real cost of meeting the basic needs of a family. Minimum wage has become what we would view as disposable jobs. However, hopefully with COVID bringing awareness to the importance of service-based industries, we could not do our day-to-day work. Our day-to-day lives would not be the same without what we consider those minimum wage service employees. A lot of those employees come from our communities, and they are desperately undervalued. They are desperately under-supported. And when we add in domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, labor trafficking, all of the other issues that primarily are affecting our communities, there's not a chance. There's not a chance of self-sufficiency without major shifts. And I agree, Leta. We need to become more active and more vocal. A lot of our agencies don't have that as an allowable activity, but each and every one of us came to this work because we wanted to make something better. We wanted to change what normal was. And this is a good way. We need to take a really hard, honest look at the programs that were developed to protect people. UVISA and VAWAS, there are currently 239,000 people who trusted law enforcement to come forward and work with the systems of justice, and they are still waiting to be safe. There's a 10,000 person per year cap. That means that some of our families are looking at 20 years to be safe. That is really and truly unacceptable.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. But I think this shows that this is not just a housing issue. When we're talking about housing, we're talking about safety, we're talking about empowerment, we have to think about minimum wage, we have to think about immigration, we have to think of overall, changing the system. So, like I said, an hour and a half will not cover all of this, obviously.
It's important to remember that minimum wage is designed so that an individual working full-time would be able to feed, house, and clothe their family on one income. That was the intent of the minimum wage was to make sure that there was a living wage, that people that worked hard could live safely. And we failed at that as a country. And it is time for us to raise our voices about that, because that is quite simply a barrier that keeps people in unsafe situations. When we look at access to medical care, a lot of the survivors that we work with are trapped in their marriages, quite frankly, because if they leave, they won't have access to medical care. These are all factors that fall into the considerations of safety, the considerations of long-term safety and accessibility and meeting those basic needs. And basing those poverty levels on food costs, they haven't adapted to the realities. There was at one point a goal in the rapid rehousing that housing costs should be 30% of a family's income. For a minimum wage family,
Yeah.
that wouldn't even pay for a motel for a week.
And on top of that, now that we have public charge concerns, right?
Right.
So the aid in which and the social services programs that are available to aid these families who are using so much of their income on rent and housing, there's going to be a lot of fear, and this is valid for many cases too. But in respect of everyone's time, it is 11:35, and I'm wondering if there's anyone else who has another question to bring it back to housing that you would like our panel or our roundtable to address. Otherwise, our information, our contact information was on ROPS's website. And so I hope that if anyone has questions for our particular programs for us, that they would reach out.
And then, so just a couple of things. This webinar will be available on the Rossi Refugee Summit webpage here probably within the week. And then we will also be sure to include contact information. The Rossi website currently has links to all of your organizations with the exception of UZEB. But I will make sure that we put out the your agency contact information too.
Awesome.
For people who think of questions in the middle of the night. Not when it's helpful.
I think that's just you, Stephanie. I think you send middle of the night emails. It was a pleasure to be in conversation with all of you. It's good to see you again. Some I've seen more recently than others. Keep doing the hard work. And thank you everyone who attended.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you,
all so
Lata.
much.
Thank you everyone for being here with us today.
Thank you,
Thank
Stephanie.
you.
Thank you to
You're
our
welcome.
speakers.
Thanks.
Everyone.
Yep.